This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with artist Derek Fordjour about his paintings, sculptures, and installations that raise questions of race, identity, and inequality. Derek discusses the journey from his youth as the son of immigrants in Memphis to the inner sanctum of the art world. He also talks about his new show titled Score, opening November 10th at Petzel Gallery in New York. Like his 2020 Self Must Die exhibit at Petzel, Score transforms the exhibit space and utilizes performance to push the bounds of what we think of as a gallery exhibit. And now, a discussion about agency and autonomy with artist Derek Fordjour. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Derek, you have a new show coming up at Petzel Gallery's 520 West 25th Street location in New York, November 10th to December 22nd. That exhibition is called Score. I do want to talk to you about that show and what to expect there, but a lot of times with artists, I love to start with a hypothetical. Let's say you're sitting at a dinner party next to someone you've never met before. They have no idea who you are or what you do. How do you describe to them what your work is and what it looks like?
Well, Craig, I'm probably the worst for that because I generally tell people I'm an artist, and then I kind of refuse to do too much description. I just kind of say I paint, draw, sculpt. But I do think it's a visual medium, and it's because whenever I start, there's so many ideas in the work. There's so many series that I work on that it really is impossible for me without visual aid to jump into content first. So I kind of refuse to do it, but I do tell people that I'm an artist and I make things all day, and I'm really happy doing it.
Sure. Well, at least you're telling them you're an artist because, if you say you're a painter, they'll ask you about what you would charge for doing the kids' nursery, right?
Listen, even when I say I'm an artist, the presumption is that I'm a hip hop artist many times.
Well, you know what? That takes us smack into the middle of profiling, right? Like,
that's right.
If I tell somebody I'm an artist, no one's going to ask me what my latest single was. So tell me about that. I mean, that goes hand in hand with your work. And I can appreciate you not wanting to tip your hand too much to the person that's asking about your work, because there is a certain amount of self-discovery that you want people to make in the process of figuring out what's going on in your work.
Right. That's right. Exactly. I don't want to guide the experience. Look, I also don't want to, I don't want to be invisible. I don't want to, not show up when I can, help support someone in that discovery. So, I don't want to give the impression that I'm completely hands off. I do think there's a benefit to speaking directly to the artist. I benefit from speaking to artists about their work. So it's just that when someone is at ground zero, maybe has no idea, I'd love for them to see things first. That's generally how I start. But yeah, that profiling thing, I guess I'm asking those questions. So the person that makes the presumption, readily that I'm a musician or a performing artist, is that wrong? Do they mean harm? Are they being careless? At worst, is it racist to make such a presumption? And I don't think it's ever one thing. I do believe that there's lots of patterning in society in terms of the way we organize ourselves, where there are patterns of overrepresentation and underrepresentation in various fields, in various parts of town. And so there's an order to our world. Albeit fair or not, it exists, and we respond to it, and we're taking data and we're using that to predict likelihoods. And that's just sort of, in our evolutionary biology. So I think as someone that finds myself on the unfortunate end of those presumptions, I think I'm just asking myself, um, how to deal with this.
Those presumptions, I mean, it wouldn't help them any if you said, I'm an artist from Memphis. I mean, it perpetuates that because, people think of Beale Street and they're just a thriving musical community there. And so, how is it that you grew up as a first generation American in Memphis and wind up finding your way into the visual arts? Because, not everyone has that trajectory.
It's a great question. A friend of mine, actually, one of my Ghanaian cousins, just forwarded me this funny clip from an Indian comic who was joking about advising her son, her daughter, dating in college, and she told her daughter, "Well, you can date certain majors. You can date, pre-med. You can date engineering, science, all the STEM." And she says, "Well, Mom, why those majors?" She said, "That's where all the Indian kids are." And the kid goes, "Well, what about art majors?" She's like, "That doesn't exist. There's no Indian kid as an art major." Of course, it's a comic, but again, she's playing with these patterns as well. It's I'm working on a painting right now for the show that puts an engineer, a doctor, and a lawyer all in close proximity, and there's a pattern, right? And those are the fields that we're kind of pushed into. I ended up in Memphis because my dad wanted to be a doctor. He came from Ghana with that goal. And, what's great about turning my age now is that I see all the other young African kids, Nigerian, Ghanaian, who are in these far out places, Ohio and Texas, in these small college towns. And it was a wave of immigration, of African immigrants that came, and many of them were seeking, their entree into the professional class, and so they tended to settle where they studied because they really didn't have much of a base otherwise, and that was the case with my dad. So we settled in Memphis. I've asked them many times why they didn't discourage my art interest, and they very kindly said, we're certain that if you had a kid that was as focused with art as you were, you would do the same. So I'm just really fortunate that way that they didn't stop me.
So how did you wind up at Morehouse?
So I'll tell you, I did not. I went on a college dropout tour that lasted about 9 years. So
that's been a trend lately on the podcast.
Is that right?
Talking to successful people about their college dropout tours.
I'm telling you. I mean, I probably did two of them. But so I started at Pratt Institute in 1992, and I was classmates with Derek Adams. I love to tell that story. I think he was maybe a year ahead of me, but Kadir Nelson, who's a well-regarded illustrator, was also in our class. I think Micheline Thomas had been a few years ahead of me as well. But during that time, man, there was no, young rock star Black artist outside of like Basquiat, that was like well known. Certainly there were artists working and showing, but we didn't have the internet. Access was very limited. So, art in the early 90s, art school still felt like certainly had not received the diversity memo worth anything. Art history was taught, much in the way it had for the last 20, 30 years prior. And so, we really were just the kind of, oddball art kids, trying to figure it out. And so I was frustrated with that experience. Eventually, I left Pratt and then, just kind of fumbled around. I actually went to classes at the Art Students League for a while. And then, I just hung out at the Met all day long looking at the American Wing and just kind of studying paintings for a while. I went to community college. I went back home. had a kid, and then after that, my younger brother was at Morehouse and kind of challenged me to come down there. And I really went there because I really didn't have many other plans other than to finish, and it was probably one of the best things I've ever done in my life.
Was it the right community for you in the school, or does Atlanta as an arts community, was it supportive?
Yeah, it actually was. I would say that the art scene has matured a great deal. I mean, that was, of course, 20 years ago. But I think the art scene in Atlanta has matured. I mean, you have Atlanta Contemporary. I mean, the Spelman Museum is, a lot more profound. Now you have UTA, which just opened a space there.
Right.
The High Museum is doing really innovative outreach. I think there's a scene. I'm not there all the time, but I do happen to know of a couple of full-time contemporary artists that do live in Atlanta, and so it seems a lot more possible now. When I was there, it was a supportive community, but I would say that those artists were not showing in museums or necessarily private galleries. There's always been this, there's several art worlds, I like to tell people. And there's always been, really for historical reasons, a kind of marginalization that pushed Black artists, let's say from the 80s and earlier, into this kind of alternate space where they're really supported by Black professionals, people like my dad, doctors, and lawyers, and but they're people that make art, and they were supportive. And I was part of a drawing circle every Tuesday night, and these guys that were really selling prints, but really doing well for themselves. And at that time, that's all I could see. And they were interested in anatomy, and they were interested in getting better. So, it's skills building, how you make a living, it becomes tertiary to like building the skills. I will say that the art program itself at that time wasn't very strong. And myself now, Sanford Biggers, Amy Sherrill, Kalita Rawls, which were all products of Morehouse, Spelman, and Clark Atlanta, we're all trying to take steps to improve that program. But at the time, you had to be really self-directed. But I did find support with those older, kind of illustrator guys. And I think intellectually, culturally, what I got from Morehouse, more than anything, really helped me understand my role in a lineage of African-American artists who have been working since slavery, in fact, that found that there were artists that would go door to door, painting white families, blacksmiths in Savannah and Charleston. So there was a long history of, Black creativity that studying African-American art at Morehouse and Spelman really connected me to, and really set me on my course.
So would we recognize your work from back then, or I feel like when I look at the lineage of your work, it feels like Fearless Foursome from like a decade ago is maybe your turning point. Can you talk a little
100%.
bit? Can you talk a little bit about before that? And I talked to lots of artists about the importance of there being a huge oeuvre, but there winds up being one painting that is a turning point and reminds us of the possibilities of what we can make. And even when I was talking to Ann Tamkin at MoMA about Matisse, he had a particular painting that was only on his studio wall, but it was obvious that it was something that he drew inspiration from. Am I picking the right painting there to point at and say, I think that's where things take a turn for you?
Well, not only are you correct, but I'm shocked that you were able to figure that out, because everything I've ever painted is not out there. That painting was fairly recently acquired by the SF MoMA.
Wow.
And they made the same observation that you did, that that was a seminal work. What's wild is I remember the hairs on my forearm standing up when I finished it, and knowing that I had arrived at something.
Hmm.
And I would say for many years before that, Craig, I was just frustrated. I had artistic skill. I loved making. I was still at what I would call the personal stage of art making. I think that, a great artwork is able to resonate on a few levels, but I do think the first level is personal, meaning there had to be something at stake for the artist. They had to experience some sense of discovery, satisfaction, in the experience of making the work. And I think you can. That's where we all enter. And so I was there for a long time because I couldn't really figure out the arena. I really wasn't around much contemporary art. I was in the South mostly, coming from Memphis, being in Georgia. The art scene, is at that time was fairly non-existent or tended towards representation. It's funny, I spoke with Shara Hughes, who is also from Atlanta, and we just had the biggest laugh about um, what we knew good painting to be, in our developmental years. So I like to say that I was, kind of like a chamber musician in that I could read music well, I could play my instrument well, but there was no way I could write a pop record, right? Organizing my own ideas and making my own sound was really, a debilitating, um, effort. So I painted portraits, and, I did, work that, was kind of embedded with symbolism, but it was very didactic and, very like, one, a legend that can, kind of, explain it. But those were my crude early attempts at, um, content and having meaning in the work. So I was always interested in that, but I don't think I knew how to read a contemporary work. And I certainly, was not knowledgeable about, Greenberg and, modernism and all the movements that came before. So that was a slow process for me. All the while I was making, but I really didn't find my voice until I really buckled down and was very intentional about finding it. I mean, I had been so frustrated and nothing else had added up to anything, that I was divorced in let's say about 2012, 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And, in the crucible of that healing process, I really squared up and, faced my ghost in the eye and went for it and duked it out.
It feels like it's also hard in that sort of place personally to find a way to take risks and a way to, if you're in Atlanta and what dog food the dogs are eating, it can be hard to challenge yourself to make cat food.
That's right. And that's a great analogy, but I mean, you're right. And look, you have no scaffolding. I mean, you're just sort of like going into the ether to, you're really going internally. But I remember saying to a very close friend, sharing some of my frustrations, and she said, Derek, the things that you get passionate about at parties and, that you can, go on for hours talking about, they're not in your work. And I remember being so enraged and offended and becoming instantly defensive, and my body temperature shot up. In hindsight, it was the truth in what
Right.
she was saying. It made me feel embarrassed, and I was really seen. I made bad work for a long time, Craig. I mean, things that were just fits and starts. Um, and I, at some point, started collecting the covers of sports magazines that featured Black athletes. I didn't really know why. Um, but there was something there, something about the commerce and
Mm-hmm.
um, commoditization, of course, race. And, um, so I just would collect those and I would paint those. And I think in the very early days when I started painting those, I remember showing a couple of people and they were like, oh, Kehinde Wiley. And I think that was a time when Kehinde was really on his ascent. And I think, believe it or not, I mean, given as much figurations out there now, at that time, a young black male figure on a bright ground was a novel image. And Kehinde really owned that. So um, thankfully, he had that space occupied and forced me to really go further into the content. Eventually, I applied to Hunter College
Hmm.
and for an MFA, and that's where I really dug in deep. But before that, for about 2 years, I had my own studio, and that's really all I had was that studio. I had gone around and asked a couple of friends. I asked 5 friends of mine to pay for a painting in advance. So, I asked them for, a sum of money, and everybody agreed. And when none of them actually came to pick up paintings. I said, give me money and then give me a year, because otherwise I would have to like sell paintings. I would have to paint,
Right.
sell them to get money, pay my studio rent, and I just could not stop that cycle. So I asked a few friends, and this is advice for any other artists out there listening that are trying to figure it out. I kind of created my own residency a little bit, and that really gave me the year to just start putting the pieces together, things that I knew were of interest, that I saw connections in, questions I wanted to ask. And I started working for Micheline Thomas actually at the time.
Oh, wow.
And Mickey was really so incredibly generous. She said I could work 1 day a week, and I asked if I could bring in my work, which again was tough at that time. And she agreed that, ever so often when I had to work, she would look at it, and she did that. So I would work for her on Fridays, and I would occasionally show her my paintings, and she would give me a critique.
So, there's what we say, and then there's the nature of how we say it, right? It sounds like your friend challenged you to take all of the intellectual thoughts that you have about society and was challenging you
Mhm.
to find them in your work. And so did you spend time like consciously kind of laying out some treatises, some basic truths that you wanted to bury in there, and then go about the process of, I mean, there's the making process, but is that married with the intellectual pursuit, or did you have these ideas and try to have that as the foundation for that scaffold of building work around these concepts?
As you speak, I realize that maybe I'm giving the Hollywood version of my life. This Rain Man moment
Well, we have
where
to
I'm,
we have to
got all
fit it
this.
into 90 minutes, right? I mean,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
have to have it for the big. You have to tie it up with the bow in the end, and
Of course,
uh,
but I'm creating this picture of me, with all these images and a Sharpie in my ear, trying to figure it out. I mean, I wish it were so clear. I was deliberate about saying, I want to figure it out, but it is the intersection of the soul searching. I was in group therapy at the time. So I was really unpacking things that I had not ever unpacked about modes of, masculinity and identity and all the things that I had inherited, and the ways of being that I had operated in and never been critical of or analyzed or questioned. So that was happening in the background. I'm in the studio with an intense focus, and I'm dealing with the fact that I don't have it together. And I think you can go in the studio and rely on your technical skill to make something attractive, but that really can be a distraction from the real quest of making something authentic.
Right.
And so I was dealing with that problem in the studio. And at the same time, I was building community. I was in a studio building with my good friend Philandus Thames. Philandus had recently finished Yale, and Sanford Biggers was around the corner, who's another Morehouse man. And he had much, had a career, and he was teaching. And so he was a wonderful resource to check in with. Jeff Sunhouse, another amazing painter, was down the hall. I think Renee Cox, who had 20, 30 years showing, was around the corner. Jennifer Packer moved in the building at some point. This was in Harlem at 141st Street. So I think being in community to artists who have varying degrees of experience, dealing with the question honestly, and then, my own personal discovery, evolution, and then heading all of that energy into a really fantastic graduate program is how eventually I chanced upon a painting like The Fearless Foursome.
I appreciate your authenticity because I feel like, this is part of the conversation I had recently with Tamashi Jackson is that,
Oh, Tamashi, she's amazing.
yeah, right. But, young artists could look at somebody like you and your work and say, Derek's got it together. I don't know how I'm ever going to get to that point. But your story reveals that it feels like you're constantly in a state of flux and messiness. And it was the community that kind of sanded the rough edges and helped you bring out your best self.
100%. I mean, look, I wouldn't have gone to graduate school if it wasn't for Hank Willis Thomas and Philandus. I mean, they told me point blank, you need to go to school. And I think they saw where I was. And, now I see artists like that all the time. And it's so apparent. I had no idea how they were so absolute, but I think they knew if you take your frustrations and your questions and you get into a pressure cooker, something can happen for you. But it was their insistence, that got me there. I love that you mentioned Tamashi. I've been a fan from a distance for a long time. We haven't been in the physical same space very often, but I think there's a lot of mutual admiration. But I think Tamashi is an artist that has a certain level of authenticity and is asking real questions from her work and has a belief that her work can do more than provide aesthetics. And I think that's what I was looking for, is like, how can my practice be something more than images to look at?
Right.
And but I will say that that Fearless Foursome painting, what was a moment. I think I was trying to not leave my hand, because there was a period of time where I let go of the figure, made some really bad abstract paintings, but I knew I had become dependent on the figure as a stand-in for emotion. And I wanted to see what I could do without that form in those years. And so I finally came back and started adding the figure back in. So it really helped with my editing. And I wanted to see if I could invoke certain associations. There's a almost dunce-like quality to those figures in the size of their shoes or the color choice. And I think really being able to tap into the uncanny, which artists like Willem Sasnal or Lucian Freud or Charles White, through simple, direct, head-on portraiture, can nod to something off-kilter, interesting, peculiar. And so I was starting to build that muscle with that painting, and it was a very satisfying moment.
Yeah, tell me about art as a tool for social change. I assume that's something that's under the surface that you strive for.
Yes, I'm going to say yes. I'm going to say yes with the caveat that art as social activism has now become a category. There are prizes, awards, funding streams. Soon there'll be classes or degrees. So I don't consider myself an activist in that vein, but I do aspire for my total practice. And for me, it doesn't necessarily have to be what the work, the conversation around the work necessarily. It can be artist as catalyst. It can be my studio space. It can be my time. It could be where I lend my name. It could be the sale of a painting and the proceeds. So I think what I understand now better is the role of the artist in society, which is so going back to those early days when it's at the personal level, all I know is that I want to make this thing and I can get lost in it for, 18 hours making it. And then on the other side of it, I have no idea what to do with it. I hope somebody likes it. So to go from there to now understanding the role of the artist in society, I think is, probably the most beneficial part of my journey. And that leads me to the very real fact that my practice itself can create social change. I've seen it happen.
I feel like there are themes that continue to come up around labor versus ownership,
Mm-hmm.
profiling, questions of meritocracy, the realities of how to escape one's situation and rise above, and what are promises and what are fallacies.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those come together in a piece from the last couple of years, Futility of Achievement. Can you talk about that painting a little bit, because that seems to be another piece that people like to point to of yours, because it seems to bring a lot of different subjects together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you ask about that painting, and I really appreciate the care you've taken to familiarize yourself with my work. Um, that's one piece that I say I don't like to give too much language to because uh, it's so open
Right.
in many ways. I will say about that work that performance is happening, a stage is happening.
Hmm.
Um, there's spectatorship, from us, from the audience, and so I think all of the things that interest me in other works that might be a bit more conspicuous around those notions of, staging, performance, that kind of thing. Um, I probably was able to, through the dressing of labor, casting this role of, a cleaner. Um, I was able to maybe expand that conversation beyond sport with a capital S,
Hmm.
into questions of power. And so that's really what's been so personally rewarding is that, the very simple kind of analogy and inquiry that started this has now grown so many branches that are an offshoot that are around, questions of power. I exist in several relationships in which I'm an artist. I have a dealer,
Right.
and so I'm always wondering where the power lies in that relationship. Um, how much mutuality is there actually?
Right.
You share every dollar down the middle, and so in many ways you're partners. I also understand that changes as an artist market evolves and matures, and galleries can be emerging and more established, and so there are many variables. But
Right.
I think at the core, I'm always asking that question. Where's the power?
I feel like I've even seen you address that in a painting before. That this whole notion of, and it's a topic that keeps coming up is, especially every time a contract's negotiated in a professional sports league. What is the value of the athlete and their contribution to the spectacle of the sport versus the owner, right? And who has the power? And if things really were as equitable as ownership says, then why doesn't ownership represent a more diverse society than it does?
And I mean, look, to go further, I mean, I was speaking to, a pretty well-known professional athlete, and he brought out something I never even thought about. I mean, this guy is top of the profession. So, we're not talking middle tier. I mean, you're talking about like, $100 million contract plus. And he said, look, I'm paid this much. I generate this much. I'm intelligent enough to hang out with the owners. I invest in many things. I invest in some things that I was turned into by the owner, but I cannot invest in the ball club that I play in. So imagine that you're at a company that won't sell you stock. So that was one conversation I had. A year later, I'm sitting next to a part owner in another professional league, multi-billion dollar. And he was telling me how he became an owner and the journey. It was a very interesting story. And I shared what I just shared with you about this player who shared. And he says, yeah, well, that's bad for competition. He's like, if a guy has ownership in the team, then the decisions that he makes on the field will be affected. Now, it really is great speaking to the person that sits in that seat because that's their perspective. It's very different than me in my studio forming these characterizations of what ownership and labor. But when you speak to a person that this is what he does, and he doesn't mean any harm to this other guy, and vice versa. But those tensions are so interesting to me, and to some degree, you do want to keep the competition pure. I mean, he's right. I mean, would I trade myself if the team I was playing for were more profitable? I mean, I would have a different incentive, right? And so things like the appearance of fairness, objectivity, really interest me. I mean, when you look at like FIFA, and there's an Italian town, I never can remember the name, that has all these football leagues where they play each other. And the mafia runs in the shadows in that town because it's a great, kind of prop for their gambling business.
Right.
And so I love these kind of like shadow economies that can like trail, a legitimate business, and talking about patterns, right? And I find that really interesting. I used to be interested as a kid as for why baseball players would go before senators. Why would our elected officials have an interest in a private business that is a game after all, where the outcome of the game is non-utilitarian. So I never understood that connection. And I started to read, there's a wonderful book called The Game that explains the investment, from a almost propaganda point of view, that we appear to be fair and that the game is not fixed, that has a social benefit, that the belief that one team can get a clean win is important to not only the success of the business, but to the country. When you think about when Cal Ripken retired and how many presidents came there, that was about labor because Cal never missed a game. And so how these um
So it's trying to connect themselves to certain values that they want to
yes,
associate with for their politics.
right. It is that idea of values, and how they can be um co-opted, subverted, um affirmed, undermined. And look, all of this grows out from the personal. I mean, from me, I'm not just making these sort of high-minded social critiques.
Mhm.
I'm also trying to find my way in this thing. I mean, there's a saying that says artists are the servants that the wealthy allow to sit at the dinner table.
Mhm.
And so you go from, literally only being able to afford newspaper and charcoal to sitting next to billionaires without exaggeration. And it can be head spinning, the spaces you occupy.
Mhm.
But knowing your position in that room becomes crucial to how well you're able to navigate. And I mean, beyond just sort of like knowing where the salad fork is, or the dessert spoon. I mean, knowing that you are on some level providing entertainment, that it's not a peer relationship. And they're also not trying to undermine you either, and that the access is good, but you will determine what it's good for. That goes back to the activism idea. So I'm making these inquiries of myself, of my journey, my trajectory, um, representation, and now as an artist, how I show up, where, what I ask for, what's important to me, what I speak on, what I don't, what makes it into my work, why.
Sure.
Um, and so, I just wanted to make sure that I implicated myself and not got lost in some kind of far flung ideas.
And I feel like that brings up questions of performance, right? And I feel like we see symbolism of some of that in your work with HBCU drum majors and the show they put on. But the show that you had a couple of years ago, Self Must Die at Petzel, and the one that's coming up, performance is a big part of what you're putting together. But I would love for you to talk more about some of the ways you've transformed these spaces and how you incorporated performance, but also just the amazing thing that you were able to find gallery partner and performance partners that are willing to collaborate with you on a scale that a lot of people aren't necessarily comfortable with in a white cube world.
Yes. Um, yeah. Now we're talking about the insanity of my world. But you're right, Craig. I mean, I have been so fortunate to find willing, generous, um, genuine partners in both of my dealers at this point, but in my team that I work with. And I would have to say that started very organically. Um, I and not that you asked this question, but it might be of interest. As a student at Hunter, my first um, write up in the paper, which happened to be in the Times, which was really amazing, was from an installation that I did called The Upper Room. And it was a gallery in the Upper East Side that was a 3-floor walk up. Wasn't a very large space, but I wanted to bring in a dirt and a tent and trees. Um, and so I hired a couple of my mates from school, and gave them what I thought was a good little bit of money. And I just kind of imagined how I wanted the space. I didn't really think about anything else other than what I wanted that room to look like, feel like, smell like, sound like. Okay. I had that down. What I did not think about were ideas like gravity, weight, scale, uh, entryway limitations, art students as laborers, bad idea.
Right.
So uh, halfway into the install, the four of us were carrying these cinder blocks up from the truck. So, this truck pulls up and it's like wrapped with blocks. And they quit after about 2 hours and just said, "Hey, Derek, sorry, buddy," and took off. So that was the last time I hired art students to work for me. But I'm saying all that to say, man, I was a slave to the vision from the very beginning, almost foolishly so. Had I known what it required to get all of that stuff up there, it would have been too much to ask, even of myself. Fortunately, I was ignorant and I just had the commitment, I had the vision. I already told the dealer this is what it's going to be. And then I had the grueling, bloody work of figuring out how to make it work. I say all that to say is that conditioned me for what I'm doing now at this scale. And I would say with each successive show, I've just been able to get closer and closer to what I envision. And, I've just been really fortunate to have people close to me that are also committed.
I believe this episode's going to come out, just a few days before your opening on November 7th. What can you tell us that might entice someone to want to come out and see the spectacle that is a Derek Fordjour show?
Well, I'll just tell you exactly what's happening, so I don't, become a salesperson. We have three parts to the show. One is a straight ahead gallery show of paintings. These are my most recent paintings. I'm most excited about these works. They are the most personal works I've done. The show itself is called Score. For all the many associations that come with score to cut, which I do very often in my work, score to compose, which I'm doing with a choreographer, and then I'm sort of scoring my life. I turn 50 next year, so I think it's really interesting to be on the precipice of 50. To be at 49 is a really potent moment. I'm sure after I cross the threshold, a lot of the anticipation and questioning will subside. But it's from that feeling that I created these paintings. So there are several paintings I'm excited to share in that gallery. There's also the largest physical sculpture I've ever made, which, if you know anything about my work, I've tended to keep sculptures pretty modestly sized, domestically sized. And so I really had a good time over the last year building this sculpture called Flock that will be in the center of the room. So that's the South Gallery. Then there's an installation called Wunderkammer, which, talking about that early installation upper room, I've always been interested in sort of bifurcating a space, split level, taking the body of the viewer up to ascend and then down to descend. But when you enter that space, which is being entirely built from scratch, and the upstairs is kind of luxurious, and I even pull colors from luxury brands, and we're building these beautiful inset walls. I must also give a shout out to Paul Rice, who's my friend and brother. We learned to paint at 15, and when I talked about some of the people that have come into my life to help me, Paul is one of them, who found me, a few years ago and just said, "Hey, man, I want to do stuff together." Paul spent years working in Hollywood on many sets and movies and large corporate clients, so his ability to build is really limitless. And so we conceived these spaces together. So you go upstairs in Wunderkammer, which means Cabinet of Curiosities in German. I like the colonial associations with that. My wife is East African. I went to Tanzania for the first time and learned a little bit about colonial occupation of the Germans in East Africa. Also, Friedrich Petzel is German. So I like the play on Wunderkammer that way. But you traverse these corridors that have all new sculptures that I made originally for the show in a variety of materials. I have wood and wire, clay, porcelain, uh, resin works, wax, um, and so you traverse those, and then you end up in a room of dioramas, and these are by far the most ambitious kinetic works I've ever made. They are both motorized dioramas. One is called cyclorama. So there's a mural of a painting that's moving on two drums in one direction while these small kinetics sculptures are moving in the opposite direction. And there's a lighting environment. I'm working with a guy named Brandon Baruch who lit the magic show for me in LA last year. And he just really understood painting, and we had a great time. And so Brandon and I will light that. So you'll have two dioramas. One is of cyclists, a bunch of small cyclists that are buzzing. The other are kind of racer rocking horse sculptures that are at it's called Queen's Race Track. And so those two will be sort of buzzing. Then when you leave that room, you will descend into the basement, which is a fabricated basement. And underneath there, you'll encounter two laborers that are real live actors. And I call this a theatrical fragment because it's not quite in the proscenium facing the audience to perform. You're sort of watching a pedestrian moment of the otherwise mundane workday of these two laborers. And I think Wunderkammer really is a critique on the way that many institutions and organizations organize themselves, where we find sort of Black and brown labor in the bottom tier around security, maintenance, maybe diversity work, which maybe is not on the bottom, but they're predictable locations, again, thinking about patterns. So I really wanted to bring in my love of theater, performance, acting in this way. And then the final part is called Arena, which I'm also terribly excited about. I have collaborated with Sidra Bell of Sidra Bell Dance Company in New York. She's an outstanding choreographer. And we have been in conversation for the better part of this year, where I was able to just engage my content. And I like to say that I bring content and my collaborators bring form. And we were able to create this emergent movement piece that is just the most stirring thing. And that will happen inside a built environment that's really kind of based on a sculpture I made, I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago. And I was so surprised at how similar it was that I asked the Studio Museum of Harlem that has that work in their collection if I could borrow it for the show. And thank you, Thelma Golden and the amazing curatorial team. They're actually going to allow us to exhibit that work. So it's a miniature version of now a larger kind of arena that people can actually sit in and watch a performance. And it's somewhere between, modern dance, busking, and maybe there's, my love of works like Simone Forti and, other, kind of seminal works from contemporary dance and performance. So that happens twice daily, Tuesday through Saturday, no cost, 2:00 and 5:00. And we offer that for 6 weeks, which that in of itself is a feat and an accomplishment. So I want to thank Friedrich Petzel, the amazing team, Seth Kelly, Andrea, the whole team at Petzel. Everybody's been on board and been outstanding. I won't start giving thank yous because it's a long list, but it's nothing short of a miracle that this whole thing can happen.
For so many artists and so many galleries, you've got a few weeks and a white box and what we can get up cheaply and quickly. And, just like a restaurant, it's about table turn, but, it's obvious that you've got a team that really cares about you being able to do something different and do something that would be of interest to a bigger institution. Derek, I wish I had more time, but I certainly encourage people to come out and see this spectacle, experience it. And so if folks wanted to catch one of the performances and make sure that they were there to see the live components, Would they find that information on the Petzel site?
Yeah, and it's open, so you can literally just come to the gallery. We're really trying not to make it, a velvet rope or something. I really want it to be that you can just sort of show up an hour before the show and get online and get on in. So it's really not that complicated, but information is on the Petzel Gallery website.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to ArtSense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.